the odds of the whole thing is I came off a plane from Germany and I'm unemployed and I need a job. And it could be any job in the world, or I could have worked for a congressman. I could have worked for a ditch digger. It doesn't, and it turns out it's for the President of the United States. Well, that's a total fluke. I didn't plan that.
But it's also amazing.
But that's the truth of all of our lives.
Stephen Hess is arguably one of the longest-serving Washington insiders you've probably never heard of. But as veteran political commentator Chris Matthews said about Washington players, my favorite political question is who is in the room? And as a White House staffer or advisor during 5 presidencies, Steve Hess was a good bet for the answer. His career began unexpectedly as a speechwriter for President Dwight Eisenhower in 1958. He was 25 years old. I'm Katie Dunn Tenpas, a visiting fellow and director of the Katzman Initiative at the Brookings Institution, and a practitioner senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. And this is Quite by Accident, a podcast about Steve Hess and his life at the center of American politics. I've known Steve Hess for decades myself, but as you'll learn in this podcast, his experience in and around politics and powerful people goes back, way back.
I was born in 1933. The President of the United States was the same president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, till
45.
Yeah, that's a long period of time.
Yeah, 12 years your first life.
When FDR ran for 4th term, 1944, and his caravan came up Broadway in Manhattan, and we lived on 98th Street in Broadway. And I could look down, and I could see FDR coming down Broadway in an open car in the pouring rain. I didn't know it, but this was a historic moment because it was the moment when FDR was trying to convince the world, his electorate, that he was well enough to run for a 4th term and driving down in the open rain. I didn't know when he got to 90, until later history, that he got to 96th Street, he took a right, went into a garage, had a rub down, took some cognac, and continued on his way. And of course, by April, he was dead. But I saw him at that moment, or I saw down on him at that moment. It was sort of an exciting time for a young man to be alive. I mean, we saved scrap metal so that our troops could make planes. Mm-hmm. We spent our nights looking in the sky, seeing if we could identify foreign plane. It turned out, it wasn't a great. If I were a little older and I'd been drafted, it wasn't a great time at all. Yeah. But we sent letters to our relatives who were in the Army. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, none of them died, but some could have. But for a young person, as I think back, what a great time.
Well, that's interesting because it's
to
also
be in a great war. We won a great war, and I was there.
But you also were born in the midst of the Depression, and most people would say that's not such a great time.
I know. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I don't think like that. And it is true because my father was deeply hit by the Depression. He had an automobile agency. People stopped buying cars. There were no cars to buy. Mm-hmm. So it was tough for him until the Depression, the war is over and everybody wants a car. Mm-hmm. And my poor father dies.
Steve's dad, Charles Hess, died of a heart condition when Steve, an only child, was just 13.
You know, we didn't have it good or bad, but we had it. I mean, mm-hmm. You know, he had a big automobile agency. Every automobile agency has a garage, and so there were no cars to sell. So he just moved over to the garage part where he did the accounting or whatever he did, and I don't know. I don't know. I have notes that I sent from my parents at that time, birthday cards, and I'll say things like, hey, it's going to be a good year next year, or mm-hmm. something like that. But it is strange. You're absolutely right. Those were not great times. Mm-hmm. We did have a car because he had an automobile agency, and we would go to Van Cortlandt Park on a Sunday, with a picnic, and the sun was shining, and my father would say, I wonder what poor people do. We were rich people. We had a picnic.
Car. Uh-huh.
Because he had been a poor person.
Uh-huh.
And how clever of him to sort of hook on to the automotive industry, which is coming along as he's a young man, and it works ultimately well enough for him.
After college in the mid-50s, Steve was drafted into the U.S. Army. He went to serve in Germany and, wouldn't you know it, that was the start not of a military career, but of a career in writing, history, and politics.
I'm in the Army. I'm attached to the 3rd Armored Division headquarters outside Frankfurt. It's a peace army. I'm bored if I'm not on jury duty, on guard duty.
Guard duty.
Guard duty. So I've got a car and I drive into Frankfurt. There is a USIA library. I think I'll learn a little more about the Civil War. I don't feel I know enough. So I'll go and read a book. So I get to the library and I see this great big fat volume. And it's a biographical sketch of everyone who has ever been in the Congress. So I start going through it. It's sort of interesting. I was a political science major. I knew about the Roosevelts. I knew about the Adams. I knew about the Harrisons and so forth. But I'm suddenly finding families that go on for generation after generation. The Frelinghuysen. What do I know about the Frelinghuysen? And hey, this is sort of interesting. And I've got, rather than being bored, I started to write little genealogical charts of these people. When I leave the Army, I've got 300 of these little charts. Well, maybe they'll come in handy someday. And they're not handy to anybody until along come the Kennedys. And suddenly people are sort of interested in the idea of families. And they're perfectly willing to give me a contract on a book which is called America's Political Dynasties from Adams to Kennedy, which does very well. So I'm suddenly in business, which I hadn't expected. I certainly wanted to write a book, but not that particular book.
In 2016, Steve updated this book, and the Brookings Institution Press released a new edition, America's Political Dynasties, from Adams to Clinton. But in the late 1950s, Hillary Rodham and Bill Clinton weren't even teenagers. Political Washington was still largely white, male, and older. Congress controlled the district's institutions, which remained segregated. And remember, this was 5 years before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Well, it turned out I'm now getting out of the Army. I've gone to college. I've been drafted. I've been sent to Germany. I'm sent home, and I'm 25 and unemployed and getting off the boat. And it turns out just at that time, my mentor from college has been appointed the speechwriter to President Eisenhower. Wow.
Steve's college mentor was Malcolm Charles Moose, a.k.a. Mac. He joined President Eisenhower's staff as a special assistant in 1957 and chief speechwriter in 1958. How fortunate for Steve, but it turns out in a pretty accidental way.
Yeah, so at any rate, how this professor I'm talking about, his name is Malcolm Moose, but in 1951, I went to the University of Chicago. I liked it fine, but 1952, in August, I visited my relatives in Baltimore. My father had come from Baltimore. And in the Baltimore Sun, there's an article that Johns Hopkins University is starting a new program that sounds great for me. You can work as fast as you want with a professor you like on a topic you like. I say, great. I get in my car. I drive over to Johns Hopkins. And I say, is there anybody here I could talk to? And political science department, she said, well, Dr. Swisher, Carl Swisher, is the chairman of the department. He happens to be in today. Knock on his door. Maybe he'll talk with you. So I knock on his door. Carl Swisher is a great constitutional authority. So I knock on his door. I tell him I'm sort of interested in transferring. And he says, name the justices of the Supreme Court. So So I named the justice of the
That was his
Supreme.
first question of
Yep.
you.
that's
Not
right,
like,
yeah.
it's so great that you're interested in this new
no,
program.
No. Here's where you are. I told him why I'm there. He says, name the justice of the Supreme Court. And I named the justice of the Supreme Court. And then he says, name President Truman's cabinet. So I started to name President Truman's cabinet. At that time, the Postmaster General was in the cabinet. So I get to that point, and I say, oh, Dr. Swisher, I can't remember. Who was it? And he can't remember either.
Ha.
So the only thing he can do at that point is admit me to Johns Hopkins.
There was no application process, no ACT, no SAT for Steve's admission. He just walked into Professor Carl Swisher's office, chair of the political science department, passed an impromptu who's who in politics quiz, and he was in.
No, wait. So there's no application process?
Nothing.
There's no ACT, SAT?
Isn't it wonderful? My grandchildren today are at the age where they're applying for college, and I think of all the things they're doing to get into college, and I think, why can't they do it my way? Just
You
knock on the
basically
door.
answered a trivia question.
Answer a trivia
Which really
question.
isn't trivial,
That's
but-
right. That's right. So that was it. And the professor that I become my mentor is Malcolm Moose, who is not only the political science professor that covers my field, he also happens to be the chairman of the Republican Party in Baltimore. Wow. And suddenly I become a Republican. He's a moderate Republican. He comes from Minnesota. But I learned my politics from him.
Moderate Republican from Minnesota meant something a lot different than it means today, if you could even say there are moderate Republicans. So Mac Moose says to Steve,
Okay, I'd love to have you as my assistant. But he goes to Sherman Adams. Sherman Adams is the chief of staff.
Chief of Staff in the Eisenhower White House, former congressman and governor of New Hampshire and World War I Marine Corps veteran.
And he was tough. He was in the same tradition that Eisenhower had Walter Bedell Smith as he called him, bastard to his bitch, son of a bitch, to Walter Bedell. And Sherman Adams says, no, he doesn't need an assistant. Fortunately, Sherman Adams was in big trouble at the moment because he was mixed up in a scandal with a man named Bernard Goldfein. In fact, he wasn't going to be there very long.
Bernard Goldfein was a Boston textile manufacturer and real estate operator who entertained governors and members of Congress from both parties. He got his friend Sherman Adams to approach federal regulatory agencies about their investigations of his business dealings. And Adams accepted from him the gift of a vicuña overcoat and loan of an oriental rug.
And Moose, who's a pretty shrewd, not only a professor, but a pretty shrewd politician, instead goes to the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Meade Alcorn, goes around the Sherman Adams. And he says to Meade Alcorn, I'm going to be writing the president's speeches in this midterm election. I could use an assistant. And Meade Alcorn says, sure, send him over.
That is, send Steve Hess over. Meade Alcorn, by the way, fired Sherman Adams, opening the door for Steve as if by accident.
So I go to the Republican National Committee, and Meade says, calls me Steve. Nobody's called me Steve at that level. And he said, how much are you going to be paid or want to be paid? Nobody had ever asked me that before. They didn't ask me that when I became a private in the Army. And I don't know, I say, I don't know why, but I say $1,000 a month. And he said, okay. At which point he said that too quickly. I probably didn't ask for enough. So I say, well, there'll be some expenses. I don't know what I'm talking about. And he said,
just made up the expense
I just
part?
made it up. I didn't. What do you say, Nick? Well, the
It's
expenses.
very bold. I like
Oh,
this.
I'm very bold. I don't know what I'm talking about. And he says, well, we'll give you an apartment. Oh, wow, I've got to have an apartment in Georgetown. And
In Georgetown?
well, it did, yeah, because I could
Wow.
pick the apartment myself. Sure. In fact, I should tell you that my college roommate, who had just become a lawyer from Yale and was now a lowly officer, a lowly lawyer at the Navy Department, and he's making nothing, and I'm making $1,000 a month. So I invite him,
Wow.
and so we had a good time. At any rate,
So $1,000 a month back then might have been a total of an annual
Oh,
salary.
wait, there's more to it, because
boy.
I then
Okay.
say, now I've got $1,000 a month at an apartment, and I say, well, Meade, this is September. Couldn't you pay me through the end of the year? He says, sure. And then your point is well taken. What is it worth now? Well, we didn't have a computer then, but now I could Google it and say, what is my salary in 1958 worth in 2023?
You can look this up yourself, but to save time, $12,000 a year in 1958 is about $127,000 today, which is a pretty good White House salary. Steve was 25 years old, and in Eisenhower's White House, this put him in the company of staffers who were a lot older than he was.
So if you're 25 years old, I'm guessing that most of the people that you worked with were probably 35, 40, 45. What was it like working in the White House?
That's a very interesting question, because at 1958, when I was the president's aide, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still in law school. John Lewis was like 7 years removed from the march between Selma and Montgomery. The Stonewall riot was still a decade away. And there I was instead writing speeches in the 7th year of a presidential administration. So the first thing you'd think about is they're a lot older than I am.
By what order of magnitude? Like 20 years, or like another generation?
Well,
or?
yeah. I mean, remember, I'm already 2 generations removed from the president, and when you look at the White House staff, there was actually one of my colleagues on the staff had been a classmate of Eisenhower's at West Point, John Bragdon. He was at West Point. He was called Poopy. Poopy. Well, it turned out to be an endearing word, because at West Point, apparently, poopy was the stuff that they studied, and so he showed he was very good at the stuff he was. But Poopy was on the staff with me, including people who had been CEOs of General Foods, big time, major presidents of major universities, University of North Carolina, Wesleyan State. So I was there with a lot of older people. In fact, of that staff, there was only one other person who was in his 20s, and he was pretty remarkable too. His name was Phil Arita. He was 28, and he was, as soon as the administration was finished, was about to become a professor at law at Harvard. Wow. And would become very quickly the greatest scholar on something or other. It was really he was an amazing person. So I didn't even think of him as just another kid like me. He was so far.
He was already accomplished.
Yeah, he was so accomplished at that time. So at any rate, it was more than just the people I was with. It was the setting I was with. You know, you start off where I was housed. I was in the executive office building, now the Eisenhower building, that great pile of bricks up right next to the west wing of the White House.
Right.
Let's pause here and think about the White House itself, where it sits in Washington, D.C., the constellation of buildings around it. You might know it today as a veritable fortress. The roads that bound it north and south closed to vehicle traffic after 9/11. High fences surrounding the perimeter, guards you can see, and probably more guards you can't see. But what was it like for a 25-year-old who was just starting out there, who had never visited the People's House before? As Steve said, his office was in what's now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, formerly known as the Old Executive Office Building. It was built in the decades after the Civil War to house the State, War, and Navy departments. Mark Twain supposedly called it the ugliest building in America. Harry Truman said it was the greatest monstrosity in America. But I think it's charming, and it's now a National Historic Landmark.
So my office, which was, looked out over, let me see. You could look it up now. Well, at any rate, it looked down on the South Lawn, I could see it if a helicopter was coming in and Eisenhower was getting off and holding his hat and so forth. I could see them putting up little candy-covered tents if Mrs. Eisenhower was having a party. I could see people going in that west wing door who wanted to get away from the press. So it was really an exciting view.
Steve's speechwriting office was in the executive office building, but he could walk just a short distance to the White House, entering through its famous West Wing, to get to Malcolm Moose's office on the other side. What was that like? I wondered.
Yeah.
And my typical day was so incredibly interesting because there I was next to the West Wing. But Mac Moose, my boss, he was in the East Wing. So every day, not only did I go down the elevator from the second floor, walk across West Executive, get into West Executive, into the building, but I had to walk entirely through the White House to get to the other end.
Wow.
Yeah, so I get in there. There's a little elevator that takes me up one floor, takes through two, and like sometimes.
Was there much security?
None. I mean, virtually none. That is a very interesting question because later, when I would go to visit the White House, and you were drenched in security, everybody knew me. I knew everybody. I walked through that, and there's the president hitting the golf balls, and I don't know anything about golf.
He had a putting green there? Or
No, he was driving it. You're a golfer, you should know. But I walk up to his Secret Service man because you just did. I said, "Excuse me, I don't play golf. What's the president doing?" Well, he's got a 9-iron, and he's driving in it, and I say, that looks pretty good. It gets about 80. I'm watching. I see how the president's dresses. That's all informal like that. Everybody seems to know me. I'm not going through anything. So I go up to one floor. Once I'm there alone with the Secretary of State, and he's just come back from Geneva, and what do you have a chance to ask one question? And I say, "Did you have a nice meeting?" And I think, what a jerk. I had one question to the Secretary of State, and that's what I asked. So you're now on the first floor. There's the Oval Office.
Right.
In fact, later when I came back under Nixon, his secretary called me and said, who are Eisenhower's friends? And I said, "Why are you asking?" He said, "Well, Eisenhower left all these marks from his golf shoes, and so we're going to rip up the carpet and put in new carpet. And we thought with the old carpet we would cut it up in pieces and give it as souvenirs to his old friends." Okay, so that's it. There's the room that's now called the Roosevelt Room, which we called the Fish Room at that time because that's where the Roosevelt had his aquarium.
And that's where the staff would get briefings from the CIA every other morning on events in the world.
So if I keep going from there, I'm walking through a street that goes along the side of the Oval Office. It's sort of like an outdoor colonnade, and this is what I'm going to be taking across to the East Wing, and that's where I see the president playing, hitting the golf in the right in the south lawn. And if it's raining, I go through the residence. If it's not, I just go out. If I go through the residence, sometimes I'm tripping over toys because the president's grandchildren are there. And I always tell that story. And Susan Eisenhower sort of became a friend of mine later. She was always furious with my telling that same damn story about how the grandchildren left their toys out and we tripped over. But if I'm going through on the outside, I would see Mamie Eisenhower's rose garden on the right. On the left, there would be a door leading to the swimming pool.
Oh, wow.
And the swimming pool was reserved for women 9 to 11. The rest of the time, we could use the swimming pool. I did it once just so I could say I swam in the pool because that was my thing. And I remember how hot it was, about 90 degrees.
Right.
It wasn't very attractive, although Jack Kennedy, when he came in, his father donated a great big portrait of Hyannisport for the wall.
And that long pool room where Franklin Roosevelt swam daily and subsequent presidents also swam was converted in 1969 by President Nixon to a press briefing room. Apparently, a computer server room now occupies the pool space. In 2000, it was named in honor of President Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, who was wounded in the assassination attempt on President Reagan.
And what's interesting is if the president had been watching a movie, the cans of film would be lined up outside.
Cans of film?
Film, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, because they had been watching a movie and the cans of film were lined. And I'm fascinated by what they've been watching.
So you snoop and look at the titles?
I rush over to see what they've been watching, Gunfighters of Abilene. He loved Westerns. In fact, I asked the projectionist who said that in the 8 years he was there, he had seen 200 Westerns.
Wow.
Yeah, he was big on Westerns. War movies didn't appeal to him much, particularly if there was something that was going wrong, and then he got mad. He didn't like Sergeant Bilko at all, I'm told.
Interesting.
Yeah. But
no light thing, no like comedy or any farce? Or...
His favorite movie, according to Jim Haggerty, was something called Angels in the Outfield.
James Haggerty was President Eisenhower's press secretary all 8 years. Angels in the Outfield, starring Paul Douglas and Janet Leigh, came out in 1951.
I think it was the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the manager, who's not a good guy, but he gets a vision from above, and he changes and he wins all the games, Angel in the Outfield. Mm-hmm. And he liked that one a lot. But the best one was Pete Orand, who was his naval aide. So he had something to do in charge of Camp David. And he told me that when the president was there with Prime Minister Macmillan from Great Britain, they showed a movie called The Mouse That Roared. Remember the movie The Mouse That Roared?
I don't remember the movie, The Mouse That Roared, a 1959 British satirical comedy starring Peter Sellers.
What happened was some little country decides to make war in the United States, knowing that they'll lose, and as a product of their loss, they're going to be well fed and taken care of. And so the president and the prime minister loved that. And in fact, the president loved it so much that he had seen it again.
So imagine Steve Hess, again, just 25 years old, joining the White House staff as a speechwriter in the last half of the second term of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and walking around the grounds, the West Wing, the East Wing, poking into the president's movie habits.
That's a nice walk you have every day.
It was a nice walk, yeah. And I bump into people along the way. Somebody is painting the White House, and I talk to them, and they tell me what color they're using. I'm pretty nosy when you get down to it. But people love to talk to me that way.
And can we back up a second? I'm
Sure.
just sort of curious how a 25-year-old makes a conversation with the former CEO of a Fortune 500 company.
Well, I don't know. When you think about it.
Everybody was just nice and welcoming?
Well, that was a very interesting thing, how nice people were to me. I think they may have thought of me as sort of a substitute nephew or something like that. For instance, Clarence Randall, who had been the president of Inland Steel, very important, was Truman had the steel strike in 1948. It was Clarence Randall who defended the steel company, so he was the one who spoke on television, and 50 million people watched him, and he really liked me. So there was a few days when they were remodeling the staff mess, and he would take me to the Metropolitan Club.
Wow.
And he would tell me stories that weren't in his memoirs and that sort of thing. Or then there was another fellow named, let me think, Earl Chesney. Earl Chesney had gotten there as an usher under Herbert Hoover. And he drew a great big cartoon portrait of me.
Oh.
It wasn't very good, but it's what a nice gesture. Why were these people always doing these nice things for me?
Of course, Steve didn't get hired to walk around and have people be nice to him. He was hired as a speechwriter, and that's the subject of our next episode. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening to Quite by Accident, a podcast from the Brookings Podcast Network. I'm Katie Dunn Tenpas at Brookings and the University of Virginia. I'd like to thank Kawili Lini Huwanga, supervising producer, Fred Dews, senior producer, Gaston Robredo, audio engineer, Daniel Morales, video editor, Colin Cruikshank, videographer, Katie Maris, who designed the cover art, and Tracy Viselli and Adele Patton from Governance Studies. A very special thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Steve Hess. Additional support for the podcast comes from colleagues in Governance Studies and the Office of Communications at Brookings.